Hey guys, welcome back to another tier list video, and today we're going to be ranking every elemental skill in the game. I actually wasn't planning on doing this, but I figured if we were going to be doing elemental bursts, for the sake of thoroughness, we might as well do elemental skills. So we have the same tier list maker thingamadoohickey over here, and I guess more or less the same rules as the last episode. But a few more things to make note of. As usual, we're doing Constellation 0 for 5-star, and Constellation 6 for 4-star, including Lisa, Amber, and Kaya. Same general rules as the burst episode, so again, just go check that episode out if you need a refresher. The skills are being graded on a relative scale. An elemental skill rated in C or D tier doesn't mean the character is objectively bad in practice, but compared to the ones above them, they may not be as effective or as necessary. That being said, given that this episode was made after the burst tier list, it may seem like certain units are considered bad if their burst and skill were put in C or D tier, but also remember that there's a lot of context beyond a surface level that may not necessarily be highlighted in this video or the previous video. We're not taking specific team compositions into consideration. Most, if not all, characters can perform in some capacity, and as a reminder, any character can be good given enough investment in this game. It just depends on how much investment it takes. So in essence, a character can have a low rated elemental skill and burst, but be a strong unit by way of their synergy or playstyle or extraneous circumstances. Once again, a disclaimer, this is not meant to instruct viewers on what characters are good or bad. It's purely for fun. Do not take this list as a guide on who to pull for or who to work on. You are free to do whatever you want, and if you're looking for actual meta videos or guides, I suggest you check out a more qualified YouTuber or theory crafter like Zajef or Zyox. Those guys are better. This is just for fun. Just a moment though, I have a quick sponsor for today. Outplayed is back. If this is your first time hearing about it, Outplayed is a video capturing software on Overwolf that works for just about every popular game out there. If you enjoy recording and sharing clips in Genshin, you can try this one out. Outplayed automatically captures any interesting highlights during your play or allows you to record manually using a hotkey, which you can then immediately port over to your Discord server or have it uploaded to YouTube, Reddit, Twitter, anywhere you feel like sharing. The app has a built-in video editor if you want to show only the best parts, and it works for hundreds of different titles besides Genshin Impact. You can use it for League of Legends, CSGO, Final Fantasy XIV, Valorant, and many more. If you already have Overwolf, then downloading Outplayed is a very easy process. If you're interested in using Outplayed, feel free to use the link on screen or in the description. It's a really simple but cool app that makes recording highlights easier for you. Thanks again to Outplayed for sponsoring the video, but for now, let's get back into it. So up in S tier, we have Yelan. Once again, her elemental skill is incredible. For mobility, for combat, it's arguably the best mobility skill in the game. The damage scales off her max health and is a low cooldown on top of a good energy charge. It would be nice if you had 2 casts of it, but given that we're talking about 5 stars being at C0, it's still pretty good though overall. It's a very fantastic skill. Not as effective as animal skills in terms of grouping up enemies, but it still has a bit of crowd control in it, and as a side note, it can also be used to escape traps like the Mirror Maiden or Ice Cage type thing. Next, we're gonna be putting in Zhongli. Zhongli, essentially, he lets you enter Minecraft creative mode. Just hold E, get a massive shield, it amps all damage by reducing nearby enemy resistance, and if you use it near a geoshield or structure, it breaks it easily. Great for mining ores too if you use the whole version, so just generally, it's a very useful skill to have. Maybe in terms of maximizing DPS, people will consider it a lower rated thing, but like overall, I can't see Zhongli's shield being anything under S tier because it just breaks the game. There's an entire meme spun around Zhongli's shield, making players bad at the game because no one feels the need to dodge anything, they just face tank everything. Up next is Child. His Raging Tides, I think that's what it's called. It's one of the best self buffs in the game, and it gives him some much needed AoE clear. Bow users, they usually struggle with AoE damage, but Child doesn't because he turns melee for a while. Riptide can deal a ton of damage against enemies clustered together if you get a critical strike. It's an aesthetically pleasing skill that won't count towards the rating, but it's a very beautiful skill. The cooldown is based on duration, which is a handy quality of life feature that I think all buff type skills should honestly have in my opinion. So as a clarification, when I say the cooldown based on duration, I know in the case of Child it's an activate, like a toggle on toggle off, and not every skill is like that, like for example Hu Tao, but I feel like if you use a skill that lasts for a maximum of 10 seconds and has a cooldown of 12 seconds, if you use it for only 2 seconds, I feel like it should automatically put it, or it should automatically refund however much the duration was going to be. Let's say the 10-second, 12-second cooldown example. If you use it for 2 seconds, it refunds 8 seconds of the cooldown immediately, so the cooldown's only 4 seconds, because it's really frustrating how you use a buff on a character, but then you switch because you have to like refresh your shield or something has to be refreshed, and now you have a completely useless character for a few seconds. Maybe that might make some characters kind of abusable, but a lot of characters are already abusable, so I don't really see how it would affect a lot of things. Just for some characters it'd be a quality of life adjustment. Next is Katsuha, another fantastic mobility skill that can also be used for combat. It pulls enemies towards his current location, and then he can crash into the ground for swirl damage, regenerates a lot of energy, and is considered a heavy attack, so it does bonus damage to shields. It can be helpful for the Abyss Mages, it can be helpful for the Lectors, or even the Mid-Trolls, like the Shield Mid-Trolls. It could be a bit helpful in dealing with those. It has deceptively wide AoE for some reason. Even though it doesn't look like it should cover the area that it should, it does, and it's a low cooldown. It would be nice if you had, again, for some of these elemental skills, their Constellation 1 or 2 would be very helpful to have, but even at base, it's a great skill to have, conceptually speaking. Next up is Shogun. It's follow-up electro damage regardless of if you do normal, charge, plunging, skill, or burst attack. The damage itself from the Eye of the Storm, or whatever it's called, the electro damage, it's not fantastic, but that's not the reason why I rated it in S tier. It's an unconditional elemental burst damage buff. I guess you could say it's conditional in the sense that like if your burst is cheap, it's not as big. If your burst is expensive, it's a lot bigger. But overall, as long as the Eye is active, everyone else's elemental burst damage, including Shogun's, gets a lot stronger. The duration of the skill is, I believe, 25 seconds, while the cooldown is only like 10. So it has generously permanent uptime. You just use it and you don't even have to worry about switching to her as soon as the skill ends. It's basically, you have a huge margin for error. There are so few characters who don't want bonus elemental burst damage. Like elemental bursts are the core part of so many characters' repertoire that it just helps everybody. Similar to Bennett's burst, it's like, who doesn't need attack? There might be like 1 or 2 characters who don't get as much of a benefit out of it, but in general, everyone uses attack. So it's a valuable skill to have. Up next is Hu Tao. It ties with Child's elemental skill for the strongest self buff in the game. It grants well over 2000 bonus attack if you have enough max HP, but apparently according to theory crafters, going for that much HP is counterproductive. I actually didn't know that, and you should go for elemental mastery past a certain point instead. Another thing about it is that it changes her charge attack animation so that it happens instantly after her normal attack, and that's awesome because Hu Tao's charge attack is pretty laggy, as is almost every other polearm user, and it's pyro damage that can't be overridden. So it's a very strong buff. I feel like if we were to attach this on any other character, like I can imagine if Ayaka, let's say instead of pyro it's cryo and she gets 2000 attack for free, that would be broken. Well, not 2000 attack for free, but even 1000 attack would be nice. And the final person up in S tier will be Sucrose. Sucrose is similar to Kazuha in function, except it doesn't let her fly upwards or crash down, but since we're assuming 4 stars or Constellation 6, that means you get 2 of her E charges. Plus, it gives a ton of elemental mastery to her team thanks to her passives, so instead of mobility, she has more utility. Over to A tier, I'm gonna put in Ganyu. Ganyu summons a target dummy that deals cryo damage on cast and on explosion, and it makes it really easy to set up enemies for her Frostflake arrow because they're all busy attacking the dummy, and she gets to stand a fair distance away and shoot for free without it aggroing onto her. Energy regeneration is good on account of half of it being on cast and the remaining half on explosion, unlike a certain bunny doll that we'll talk about later. Next is Ayaka. So for her, I feel like a lot of people will disagree with it because I think it's just a burst of cryo damage in an area, which is true. That's exactly what it is. It's a burst of damage in an area that regenerates a ton of energy for her. It's unremarkable otherwise, but the damage scaling on it is almost on par with weaker elemental bursts, and it's also a decently low cooldown. I think out of all the single instance damage skills, not half bad. It's one of my favorite ones, I think. Then up next, we have Kokomi. Where is she? There she is. Kokomi is similar to Ganyu. It's a stationary summon that deals pulsating hydro damage at fixed intervals, but instead of drawing aggro, it heals nearby active friendlies. It's a serviceable ability overall. It can be used for sustain and reactions. The base damage can leave a lot to be desired, so it's really just a heal and occasional source of hydro, but the only alternative to that is, I believe, Mona's, and from what I've heard, Kokomi's hydro application is a bit more consistent than Mona's. Then we have Xiao. 2 fast dashes with great damage and energy charge. It can be used in the air to propel you forward for mobility. It's good for repositioning as well. Relatively low cooldown, not much else I can say. It's just a really good ability. It would be an S tier if you still gained energy when using his lemniscatic wind cycling while his elemental burst is active, because it doesn't regenerate energy. You can still use the dash for the damage and repositioning, but it doesn't regenerate energy. If it did, then I would put it in S tier. Speaking of self buffs, we have Yoimiya. Strong attack steroid. It empowers auto attacks to deal increased pyro damage. Standard fare. Nothing too strong or weak about it. It's honestly the only thing that keeps Yoimiya viable in light of how awful her burst is. It's a good skill to have. I don't really think there's anything that needs to be better or worse about it. Next is Ayato. it's persistent Hydro DPS that scales based on max HP, and it ramps up with every attack. Considering it's the focal point of his playstyle, it carries more weight than his elemental burst more often than not, so just like Yoimiya, he's more known for his elemental skill, not burst. Unless I'm wrong though, the main issue that prevents it from being S tier is that Ayato can only attack the same location. So against enemies that move around a lot, that screws over his uptime, but if you're chain freezing 24/7, then it really doesn't matter anyway. Couple more in A tier, we're gonna have Goro. Goro's skill is extremely situational. It only works in Geo parties, but excellent when in those situations. A ton of defense, Geo damage, crit damage, healing, and super armor, but just only to Geo characters effectively. That said, it's a lot of freaking Geo support. My god, this guy is the only reason Geo teams are even a thing in all honesty, which is a shame because I feel like the problem with Geo teams is that they're really insular. They only really allow other Geo characters, not saying that you can't include other elements to Geo teams, but I feel like Geo characters in general, a lot of them only like to stay within their lane and they don't let anyone else in and they don't go out, if that makes sense. Hopefully we'll see more Geo units in the future that change that though. Then we have Fischl. As mentioned in the Elemental Burst episode, Oz is an exceptionally strong summon when used correctly, but a lot of said use is dependent on her elemental skill to start the effect and then her elemental burst to refresh and maintain its uptime. On its own, the skill has long periods of downtime. Her elemental burst is half of her elemental skill, and her elemental skill is the other half of her elemental burst. It's like the same ability, but just split in two. It's an obvious S tier if we factor in the burst refreshing it so that it has almost permanent uptime. Fischl's elemental burst and skill are so intertwined with each other that I honestly have no idea where to put her without breaking my own rules. Then, last but not least, we have Xingqiu. Very solid, if not substantial amount of hydro damage and battery. It suffers from a long cooldown though. You can bypass this with Sacrificial Sword, but that hamstrings your damage ceiling on him, which is why I put it in A tier, not S tier. But you really cannot go wrong with Xingqiu's skill. It's a huge amount of energy, it's really solid damage, and it even gives you the Rain Sword effect by a tiny amount. So that is A tier. Let's move on to B tier. Mona is first. Another decoy skill, but instead of one burst of cryo at the start and end, it's just continuous hydro damage, which is awesome for chaining freeze, but not really for like vaporize, or I don't think electro charge works either. Energy charge is granted on explosion instead of on cast though, so it's not as effective of a battery as Ganyu's, but it's made up for by applying hydro a bunch of times. She can also have near permanent uptime thanks to her sprint, creating like a short lasting one, but it's hard to pull it off consistently because of the animation lag in her dash, which is part of the reason why I don't like playing Ayaka, since her dash, it's hard to like use her dash normally because you can't use it till like animation cancels since it itself has ending lag. But moving on, we have Beidou. So her skill is interesting. It requires precise timing and understanding of enemy attacks, but it can dish out staggering amounts of damage on top of letting you tank enemies for a bit, and it's got a low cooldown as well. I believe if you take at least 2 hits, which is the maximum, the total damage is over like 800% or something ridiculous. Regenerates 2 energy if you fail to parry though, and 4 if you time it, so if you want to get the most bang for your buck, you have to know enemy attack patterns or you have to time it consistently, which is why I put it in B tier, not A tier. It's a little too execution focused. Kuching, kind of an ultra copium, but I actually think her skill is underrated as hell. It's an electro imbue, although unfortunately it can be overridden, and the damage scaling on it is not half bad in relation to the cooldown. It gets bonus points for allowing you to activate from range via charge attack instead of recast, so you can play around with other builds like Pyro or Physical Coaching if you want to do it with Superconduct abusing, or if you want to do it with Bennett C6. It's a cool skill. Definitely a really cool skill. Next is Xiangling. Guoba's alright. The little pepper drops is pretty good for your main DPS, but really the only thing that people use Xiangling for is Pyronado anyway. Guoba attack is more of an afterthought they use just for a little bit of energy and pyro damage. Not much else to say. Then we have Sayu. I was thinking about putting it in C tier, but I value mobility a lot, and the damage does ramp up with constellations, so it's doable, but people might disagree. I feel like players either think Sayu in general, like her burst and skill, is either top tier or complete dog water. I'll just put her in the middle. Bennett. Fire version of except it does less damage in exchange for a much shorter cooldown. Solid energy battery at the end of the day, only that it's spread out across multiple casts instead of one big one. Any skill that batteries efficiently and easily is, for me, at least a B tier. Then we have Rosaria. It's an ice version of Xingqiu and Bennett in terms of what it wants to do. It's an energy battery with a low cooldown that does a moderate amount of damage. Not much to say really about it. The dashback can be useful for dodging certain attacks, but you can't do it against large enemies, which can hinder the versatility of it. And I believe if the target dies before she gets the second stab, you only get half the amount of energy, which really sucks. For the most part, Bennett and Rosaria, I consider them to be more conditional in terms of a battery than Xingqiu, which is why they're down here and he's up there. Venti. Venti's skill is a clunkier version of Sucrose's. The whole skill can help out with vertical ascension for exploration, but as a combat talent, the animation takes way too long and it doesn't even pull enemies together. Does decent damage otherwise, but not enough to offset the lag. Kaya. It's a blast of cryo damage. That's about it. It's a great energy battery, but unremarkable otherwise. I know it can heal, but the healing is so negligible that most people don't even notice it anyway. Then we have Ningguang. In her defense, it's a beautiful animation, and the Jade Screen blocks enemy projectiles, which can come in handy depending on the situation. And while Constellations and Talents provide buffs, they're not the kind that most people want, or it's too niche. Not very reliable as a battery either, even with sacrificial frags, because Ningguang is the only character, to my knowledge, with an internal cooldown for particle generation. So there's legit a hard cap on how much energy you can get per time frame, which is really unfortunate for her. I feel like she could be a fantastic battery if she didn't have that. Shinhe. Her skill is quite effective when used correctly, but given that it only affects cryo damage, I can't really see myself putting it in A tier. Also, unlike the other 5 stars that get an extra charge of this skill from Constellations, her skill gets noticeably buffed because of the damage bonus it grants based on press and hold, and with a second charge you can have both buffs activated at the same time, in which case then I would put her squarely in A tier, but as per the rules, 5 stars are at C0, so we can't do that. Jean. Decent skill, does everything you want it to, it's just that Sucrose and Kazuha do it kind of better, and throwing enemies away from you is counterproductive anyway. I don't really have anything else besides that. Diona. Like Xingqiu and Bennett and Rosaria, it's a battery that provides a decent shield and some utility. Not the best, but certainly not the worst. It does almost no damage otherwise, so you're basically just using it for the shield, but she does have a few supplementary buffs for that shield that can come in handy, like movement speed and stamina reduction. Razor. Another battery type ability, it's electro damage. I would have put this in C tier, but with Constellation 4, it gains a defense break, which is really good to have in light of not many characters reducing defense. It's usually elemental or physical resistance that goes down. It is phenomenal damage scaling, especially for a 4-star, but that scaling is made less appealing by the fact that Razor builds physical, not electro damage. I understand that you don't have to build in physical damage if you don't want to. You can do electro Razor, but there's a counterproductivity in it that I think a lot of 4-stars have. A lot of conflicting designs where there's one stat that affects half of their kit and another stat that affects the other half, and they don't intermingle with each other. We have Sara. Her skill is kind of like a budget Bennett. It provides a significant attack bonus to the active user for a short period of time, but in a very convoluted way. Though Constellation 6 provides a crit damage boost of 60% to all electro damage dealers, thing is that essentially implies it's only good for Shogun and maybe Kuching. Everyone else only gets the attack bonus. If it was a flat 60% crit damage no matter what, she would definitely be S tier. Up next is Ito. It's another target dummy type ability, except it does geo damage, which means you can't use it for reactions other than crystallize. Ushi lets Ito stack up superlative strength, so it's more of a selfish decoy compared to the others, but a decoy is still a decoy, good for managing clusters of enemies, and it does the most amount of base damage and generates full energy up front compared to the other ones. Diluc. When I was making this tier list, I was showing it to Sajef, and he told me that Diluc's skill is complete garbage, but I disagree, I like it a lot. 3 hits of pyro damage with no internal cooldown in between each attack. The damage scaling is pretty low, it's only slightly better than a normal auto attack, but it's very consistent and fluid. I suppose if you combine all 3 hits of them together, then it looks like a lot of damage, but individually they are very weak, for an elemental skill anyway, on a 5-star. That being said, it's one of my favorite skills of all time, even to this day. Eula. Interesting mechanic where the press and hold versions build off of one another. The idea is to press twice and then finish with the hold to break physical and cryo resistance. It's a very useful, albeit situational debuff, but a major downside to it is that it doesn't battery all too well. And I know I keep repeating the whole concept of battery, but in Genshin, energy charge is super important for maintaining consistency for parties, and if a character has bad energy regen, then that automatically bumps them down a few pegs in terms of usefulness and versatility for many players. Then we have Miko. The elemental skill does a crap ton of persistent damage, but really it's only there to set up your burst and doesn't do a whole lot otherwise. I know more of the damage is on the skill and not the burst, but in terms of if we're talking about getting it all at once, I don't really see it to be anything better than B tier. It's periodic electro damage every 2 or 3 seconds to a nearby enemy. Maybe if it was to all nearby enemies every 2 or 3 seconds, then I would put it in S tier. Next is Hazel. I don't know too much about it, but from like the bits of info I do have about his skill, it gets stronger the longer you charge it up for, but it requires you to stand in place for such a long time, and unlike Jean's, I don't think it's an active hitbox, so you can't keep enemies stuck together. It does a crap ton more damage though, so there's pros and cons to it. You can get an instant full power Falcon Punch by triggering swirls prior to using it, which saves a bit of time, but from what I was told, a lot of people just use the press version for a swirl reaction. Up next is Albedo. Creates a pulsating burst of geo damage and like an elevator or a flower that can produce an elevator. If it was any other element but geo, it would be a lot better. It's okay though, respectable damage. That's it for B tier. Now we're gonna go down to C tier and talk about Barbara. Passive regen and wet status, plus lower stamina consumption and bonus hydro damage thanks to constellations and passive talents. Not the worst, but I wouldn't prioritize it, and it's in C tier because it generates no energy. If it generated energy based on a certain condition, then I would put it in B tier or maybe even A tier. Yunjin. Also another ability I don't know a whole lot about, except it feels like a far worse version of Beidos. That might be a very premature assumption to make, but from what I'm guessing, that's exactly how it works, like just by looking at the description and seeing videos of it being used. Next is Toma. It's a damage and shield that can be stacked, except to get the double stack, you need Toma's burst. So by itself, it sucks. And honestly, MiHoYo, can they just buff the numbers on this guy? That'd be so freaking good if he just had better numbers. Toma's concept would be awesome if he wasn't so weak. Then we have Klee. Jumpty Dumpty is cute, but very inefficient. I actually kind of wish Jumpty Dumpty was the decoy instead of a frag bomb because it would make it super easy for Klee to attack freely without having to waste time repositioning. Does a lot of damage, it's just really awful to use. Then we have Noelle. It's a weaker Zhongli shield, but has the added benefit of healing her entire party with every attack. So it accomplishes the same job of making her team basically invincible, but through extra steps, and it doesn't amp her team's damage. It doesn't have any energy regeneration at all. If it did, then I would put it in B tier. Then next is Chongyun. He makes a cryo field that imbues all melee units with cryo. At the present moment, there's not much of a need for a cryo imbue, but if in the future there is, we might see a lot of use from this. C tier for now. The cooldown is too long to serve as a reliable battery. A small perk is that it easily breaks hydro shields, but when was the last time we had issues doing that? There are so many other cryo elements that have persistent effects like Rosaria, Diona, Ganyu, Ayaka. We haven't had issues breaking hydro shields in a very long time. Yanfei. Energy battery skill that maxes out her seals for an instant full power follow-up charge attack. It does what it needs to do, no more, no less. It would have been nice if it did a bit more though. Priming your charge attack doesn't really scream poggers to me. Maybe you can make an argument for putting it in B tier, but I think it could have done a bit more than just give her a free max power charge attack. Shinobu. I know I didn't rank Shinobu in the Elemental Burst tier list, but I did get told about the Elemental skill a bit. It suffers from Toma syndrome, where it's subpar damage, subpar electro application, subpar healing. Supposedly, it should get better when Dendro's out. You're gonna be seeing this by the time Sumru is long out for, I believe. You'll see this sometime maybe early December, but at the time of recording this, it's August 23rd, so the day before 3.0 comes out. But yeah, supposedly it could get better come Dendro, but at the moment, it's great taste, but under 2 numbers. If the numbers were better, that'd be nice. That's it for C tier. Now let's move on to D tier. Amber. Baron Bunny sucks. It just sucks. Moving on. Lisa, also same thing. Violet Arc sucks. It does a ton of damage but lacks a lot of crucial quality of life features. You can get some of them from constellations and they are being considered, but it's such a terribly designed skill overall. The tap generates 0 energy and the hold cast time is too long for how worth it is. If it was similarly to, let's say, Yanfei, where you can get an instant full charge attack of it, then maybe I would put it up higher because it's a lot of freaking damage. But to get that, you have to essentially be standing still for 2 seconds. It's so long. Aloy, it's Klee's Jumpty Dumpty if it was even more inefficient, except it's a decent battery, but it's still a pretty crappy skill overall. Xinyan, shield and pyro damage, but it scales off of defense instead of HP, so it's like Toma, but slightly worse. And also the fact that it's dependent on the number of enemies. I know with Ascension talents and constellations, it reduces the number of enemies you have to hit, but still. Then we have Aether and Lumine. Very underwhelming skills in practice. The only reason Geo Traveler is useful is because of their burst. The elemental skill can theoretically do a ton of damage, but mechanically it's a bitch and a half to pull off, so it's not even worth it. Also, Zajef, actually, is it Zajef or Zajef? I need to know. Someone tell me how to pronounce that, because I feel like I'm pronouncing it wrong. He tried to convince me that Animal Traveler's skill is strong, but screw it. They all suck. Actually, that's not true. Electro Traveler's skill is not bad, but these two, ass. And finally, Chi-Chi. For absolutely 0 reason, it generates no energy whatsoever. Why? And before you say, oh, her elemental skill gives you massive amount of healing, that's not her elemental skill, that's her passive. The actual orbiting thingamadohiki doesn't apply the talisman that heals, that's just her passive. So her elemental skill is just that orbiting bit of cryo damage, but there are so many other ways to apply cryo in this day and age that Chi-Chi, her skill is so bad. It's oh my god, it's bad. Alright, that's about it. I know, again, when you see this, this will be well after Sumeru comes out, but I have not seen Tonari, Kole, and who is this one again? What's her name? Oh, I forgot. What's her name? No, I know this. Is it Dory? I think it was Dory, yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed watching. Let me know your thoughts on if you agree or disagree. I'm most likely gonna get a ton of people who disagree, but if you do, let's be civil about it. Please don't tell me to kill myself because I like to live. So yeah, let me know if you agree or disagree, if you think certain characters should be higher up or certain should be lower down. Aside from that, if you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow my Twitter, join my Discord server, and check out my previous episode on ranking elemental bursts if you haven't yet. Till next time though, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.